She left her wedding ring behind. That is the detail that opens everything. The single object left sitting in a Philadelphia hotel room that asked a question no one could answer and that no one has ever stopped asking. A woman who traveled to a city to support her husband does not leave her wedding ring behind by accident. She does not walk out of a hotel room and forget the ring on her finger as she might forget an umbrella or a book. A wedding ring is not that kind of thing. And when investigators found it there, sitting in that room while Judy Smith herself had vanished into thin air, it became one of the most haunting details in the case, full of haunting details. A marriage reduced to a piece of metal on a hotel nightstand, a symbol of union left behind in a room where something had clearly gone terribly wrong. Judy Smith was found 5 months later, not in Philadelphia, not anywhere near the city where she had disappeared. She was found in the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina, more than 500 miles from the hotel where her ring was waiting. She was found as skeletal remains by hikers moving through remote terrain that ordinary people do not stumble into by accident. She had been stabbed to death. And the question of how a woman who had been in a Philadelphia hotel room came to be buried in a forest in the mountains of North Carolina, and who put her there and why, and how they have managed to avoid accountability for nearly 30 decades, is the question at the center of one of the most disturbing and underexamined murder cases in the history of the American South. This is the story of Judy Smith. It is a story about a woman who was a nurse, who dedicated her professional life to caring for other people, who loved her family and built a life in North Carolina, and who traveled to another state in April of 1997 to be a supportive partner to a man who was supposed to be her partner in return. It is a story about the geography of betrayal, about 500 miles of American landscape that someone drove or traveled through with a woman who was dead or dying, who chose remote forest terrain to hide what they had done, and then who returned to ordinary life and has apparently been living it ever since. It is a story without an arrest, without a conviction, without justice of any kind. And it is a story that the people who loved Judy Smith have never stopped telling. Judy Smith lived in North Carolina, and North Carolina was in her bones in the way that a place gets into you when you grow up there and build your life there and plant yourself so deeply into a community that the roots are not separable from the person. She was a nurse, a profession that in the late 1990s was even more demanding and even less recognized than it is today, and she brought to it the particular gifts that made her effective in the ways that matter most in nursing. Patience, attentiveness, the capacity to be present with people in the moments when they most need someone present. The people she worked with knew her as someone who showed up fully, not just professionally, but personally, someone whose care was not a performance, but a genuine orientation toward the well-being of others. She had married a man who was a lawyer, educated, professionally accomplished, someone whose career occupied a different register of public life than nursing does, whose work in the legal world gave him a particular kind of social standing and a particular kind of confidence in navigating institutional systems. The marriage had brought them to a life in North Carolina that was, on its surface, comfortable and established. They had a home, they had a community. They had the architecture of a life that looked from the outside like the product of two people who had built something together. What it looked like from the inside, what the actual texture of their relationship was, what tensions or griefs or unresolved conflicts lived within it, is something that investigators spent years trying to understand and that the public has never had full access to. In April of 1997, Judy's husband was scheduled to attend a legal conference. The specifics of the conference, which organization was hosting it, what its precise subject matter was, and which of his professional colleagues were attending are details that existed in the background of a story that quickly became about much more than a professional event. What mattered was that Judy accompanied him. She was there to support him, to be present at a conference that was his professional obligation, to do the thing that spouses do when their partner has an event in another city. She came along. She packed a bag. She traveled with him to Philadelphia. She checked into a hotel room in a city that was not her home, in a state that was not her own, far from the familiar terrain of North Carolina and the community that knew her. The conference began. The first day passed, and then, at some point, at some specific moment in time that has never been definitively established in public record, Judy Smith disappeared. She was not there when she should have been there. She was not where she was expected to be. The hotel room, when it was eventually examined, contained evidence of her presence and one piece of evidence of something else entirely: her wedding ring, sitting there in a room that she had occupied and then left without explanation. Her husband reported her missing. He told investigators that he did not know where she had gone, that she had been there and then she was not, that he was concerned and that he wanted the authorities to find her. He was interviewed by Pennsylvania police. The missing persons investigation that followed was conducted with the resources available to law enforcement in a major American city, handling what initially presented as a missing adult, a category of case that in 1997, before the systematic improvements and missing persons protocols that advocacy groups have been fighting for, did not always receive the immediate intensive response it deserved. The search for Judy Smith produced nothing immediately. She was not found at area hospitals. She was not located at the bus station or the train station. She had not checked into another hotel. She had not used her credit cards. She had not contacted friends or family back in North Carolina. She had not, as far as anyone could determine, simply walked away from her marriage of her own will free and started a new life somewhere else. She had vanished in the complete sense of the word, the sense that when investigators examined it honestly, implied not a voluntary departure, but a violent one. Back in North Carolina, the people who knew Judy Smith were alarmed by her disappearance in a way that did not leave much room for benign explanations. Those who knew her, those who had worked with her and socialized with her, and understood the rhythms of her life, did not find it plausible that she had simply chosen to vanish. Judy Smith was not the kind of person who disappeared. She was not someone in the grip of some private crisis that might have driven her to run. She was grounded and connected and present in her own life in ways that did not suggest a person on the verge of flight. The people who loved her knew from the beginning that something had happened to her, and the something they feared was something that could not be fixed. 5 months passed. 5 months is a long time. It is long enough for the initial wave of media attention and investigative momentum to fade. It is long enough for the daily cycle of news to have moved on to hundreds of other stories. It is long enough for most casual observers to have filed the case away in the back of their minds under the ambiguous category of unresolved, still technically open but no longer actively urgent in the public consciousness. And then, in the autumn of 1997, hikers moving through the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina made a discovery that pulled the case back into sharp, terrible focus. They found human remains. They were skeletal. 5 months in the exposed terrain of a forest in the mountains of North Carolina does that to a body, particularly in the heat of a North Carolina summer. The remains were in a remote section of the forest, not near any trail or road that a person would find by accident, in the kind of terrain that requires deliberate navigation. You do not stumble into the remote sections of the Pisgah National Forest. You go there intentionally. The remains were identified as Judy Smith. The identification brought an answer to the question of whether she was alive. She was not, and it raised, with terrible immediacy, a question that had always been hanging at the edges of the investigation, but that could now be asked with full directness. How did a woman who disappeared from a hotel in Philadelphia end up in the mountains of western North Carolina? Philadelphia to the Pisgah National Forest is more than 500 miles. That distance is not covered accidentally. It is not covered by a woman wandering disoriented through the American landscape. That distance requires a vehicle and a driver and an intention. It requires someone to have transported a body or a dying person from one state to another across hundreds of miles of American highway, and then to have carried her into remote terrain and left her. The forensic examination of the remains was conducted under the challenging conditions that 5 months of exposure in a forest imposes on physical evidence. What investigators were able to determine, despite those challenges, was that Judy Smith was stabbed. She had been killed by stabbing, an act of violence that is profoundly personal in its nature, not the distance of a gun, but the proximity and force of something held in a hand, something close, something intimate in its terrible way. Stab wounds require closeness. They require being in the same space as the person you are killing. Whoever murdered Judy Smith was close to her when they did it. The wedding ring in the Philadelphia hotel room acquired new significance once her remains were found and the manner of death was established. A woman who travels to Philadelphia with her husband does not leave her wedding ring in a hotel room unless something happened in that room. The ring sitting there was not evidence of anything, legally, not without more, but it was a detail that investigators and everyone who examined the case returned to again and again because of what it implied. Has she taken the ring off in anger? Had someone removed it? Had it been left there deliberately as some kind of message or statement? Or had the events that followed her disappearance unfolded so quickly that there was simply no time to retrieve it? The ring did not speak, but its presence in that room without the woman who was supposed to be wearing it spoke volumes. Her husband was from very early in the investigation the